So we're going to talk about a natural language pipeline, and I think if there's one thing that it's been really wonderful just hearing everybody talk. Is talking about pipelines, and I want to kind of switch to moving from process to pipeline, because fundamentally you need a pipeline. It's never going to be like a simple one process. And so this is a natural language pipeline, or how I learned to give up on general AI and embrace domain specifics. So, aging myself a little bit, this is general AI. His name is Johnny 5. Some of you may recognize him from the 1986 movie Short Circuit. I remember absolutely nothing about this movie except for I think Jeff Goldblum was in it. And this scene in which Johnny 5 is in a library just going, reading pages and understanding everything about humanity. And that's what's going to happen, you guys, so we should just pack up and go. Of course, that is not necessarily the reality, but it was a beautiful vision. This is another sort of beautiful vision that comes from in case you didn't know, I'm American. This is the American rendition of a time machine, H.G. Wells' Time Machine, which they decided to relocate in New York so that they could put it in the middle of the New York Public Library, which is what you're looking at in the background there. That orb in the center is supposed to be their New York Public Library's general AI, and it's a compendium of human knowledge that you can speak to through the looking glass and can tell you everything that you needed to know. I was, again, fascinated by this idea so much that I actually went to work for the New York Public Library. And this is from my days at the library. What I did was work for their nascent at the time digital library program, where New York Public Library has tons of physical assets. And they were like, oh, let's convert these into digital assets because that's what everybody's doing. And just to sort of belabor the point here, what you're looking at in the background is a camera with a light and then a little area set up there where the digitizers themselves would go page by page and take a picture and then save that picture and say where they had it from. And then my team would go and say, oh, let's do OCR on this picture, and we can extract all the text information and wrap it up in a nice XML document so that it becomes metadata for the archives. I did that for a while. I'm not responsible for this site, which is actually very amazing that the work that we started, it's over 10 years ago now, is now available for API so that you can go and search the New York Public Library's digital archives and find stuff. But I had a different calling. So we were at the time were taking physical archives, they became digital records encoded with metadata. I was like, that's great. It's archival, which is not really what the promise of the internet at the time was. The internet was like, we can do rich, dynamic experiences that are going to be amazing. And I was like, yeah, I don't know if I should stay at the library so long. So I moved on, and you know, internet promised these rich dynamic experiences and served us a bunch of banner ads, right? Which is a funny joke, but the truth of the matter is advertising has and continues to fuel a substantial portion of the innovation on the internet. And that was sort of true for my career, was the ability to actually go into advertising where a lot of money was being spent to do what's called first to market things and do things that are going to be top of mind, utilizing the latest technologies. So I did that for a bit. One of the things that I was really fascinated with, I remember at the time that CNN was like on par to being like a banner ad on CNN at the time was on par for a Super Bowl ad. Everybody was like, we need to be on CNN. I love CNN. I was at the time watching CNN a little bit too much. I had it as my background noise. And the thing about CNN and the news is that the news is constantly happening. It's always changing. It's not something that stays static. So if you watch the news for the full day, the story that you may hear at 6 p.m. news is going to be completely different from how it started throughout the day. It just sort of shifts and shifts and shifts and shifts. And I was really fascinated by this. Like, if there was only a way, but it wasn't there yet. So eventually, I made my way to Quartz. And Quartz was founded under this proposition, which is, what would The Economist look like if it were founded in 2012? right? And this was an advantage for Quartz because if you know anything about the news media, there haven't been a lot of new companies. Most of the companies are legacies. They have great amounts of stuff, but they carry those legacies with them, which means that they can't move quickly, they can't really disrupt. Whereas Quartz was coming around saying, we were founded by the Atlantic, like, hey, let's do this thing that's gonna really disrupt news specifically for global business leaders. And so what that looked like was, one, we were user-first, user-focused. And so rather than doing the traditional news beat, we started working on obsessions, where journalists picked the things that they were obsessed about. The editors chose what were the most important obsessions for a period, and those were the things that people were writing about because those things sort of intersected far more than just like, this is just a technology story, or this is just a politics story, or this is just a business story. They all sort of merged, and the obsessions were the things that was holding them together. This top chart, if you look at, is really sort of laying the groundwork for what the experiment that would become Quartz was about, which is that, you used to check your news at specific times, maybe in the morning, maybe in the evening, but with the rise of the internet, with the rise of digital, you start checking your news constantly. Everybody is constantly checking their news. The other one here is one of our favorites, which is that in 2016, you can see that mobile behaviors sort of crossed over the desktop behaviors. Quartz launched in 2012, and we launched as a mobile-first company before this threshold happened because we were like, this is what's going to happen, this is where news is going, and we want to be prepared there. And so when we first launched Imagine, we didn't even have a homepage. We said, social is the big thing. Everybody's just going directly to the article. Nobody needs a homepage. We've changed that, but these are the type of things that the radical approaches that Quartz was taking. The other things was that we wanted to really represent some sort of first ways of presenting this information. So our first app, rather than even like doing what everybody did, which was just like cram our web page into an app, we said, let's have conversations. And so we built a conversational interface for the news, which was our first app. We launched the Quartz Daily Brief was actually our first product, which is a morning newspaper, which is a morning newsletter, which is exactly towards those user behaviors of like business leaders are checking their news first thing in the morning. So we wanted to be the first thing in the inbox. So we created that. And then we have our obsession, which is more of a long form email. And again, we went and said, let's experiment a little bit more. So I think just recently, Google sort of made AMP a standard for emails. But before that happened, we were actually doing interactivity in emails to be able to do polling from within your email client. And those type of things are things that really excite me in terms of technology. Lastly, we have been focused really heavily on the experience as users by creating a community. So we've created a community platform where these global business leaders can then come together and start talking about the news. The thing that you'll notice through all of these is lots and lots of content. And the last sort of principle is we are a tech company. This is a famous quote, every company is a tech company. Quartz itself is a tech company. We were founded on the principles of using the technology to sort of do our main value proposition. But if you pair that with another one, which is that every story at its core is a business story, you start understanding what it is that Quartz is trying to offer to its users, which is providing the business perspective for the things that are happening in the news to business leaders that need it most immediately. Whew. All right, so that's sort of the background. One thing, when I joined Quartz in 2015, and I go through my whole onboarding training, and one of the things that they hand me is the Quartz style guide. And most of you who've worked in any type of front-end capacity may recognize style guides as being, here's how the logo works, here's how you put the logo in this color, here's how you do headlines, etc. This style guide was actually for journalists about how they're supposed to write in a voice which is called Quartzy. And so it includes things like you should only be utilizing the active voice, you don't want to be overstating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these rules around styling for the actual language. And that was like, I have found the place that I want to be. Going back to Johnny 5, like maybe. So in 2016, we did an experiment where we had an event in San Francisco called The Next Billion. And we decided we were going to try and create live data. So we had over 20 speakers on the stage throughout the day, 8 hours. They were presenting, and we were going to transform their presentations into data that was queryable through Slack, conversational AI, on the spot immediately. And so this is an example with Benedict Evans. He's talking, it's automatically being parsed, the key terms are being pulled out, we know the event and the person that's sort of speaking it. And we did this for 8 hours through, like I said, 20 different speakers. It was a wild experience. Now I'm gonna be perfectly, completely honest. At the time, actually doing audio speech to text was not gonna cut the mustard, especially when you have multiple people on stage. You actually couldn't do it fast enough to sort of get it, and there was a lot more cleanup. So our pipeline from that was, we had the stage, and then there was a stenographer who's a domain expert specifically in being able to deal with conversations that are happening live and translating that. Then we had our own content editors who would take the stenographer's text, just give it a spot check to make sure it was fine, pass it in through spaCy, which then went to a data store, a backend that attached to Slack, and the users could go on the spot and query what was happening on the stage. So a user or a speaker coming off of the stage was able to walk out into the lobby and see a quote from their presentation live on the monitors outside. That was a pretty fascinating undertaking. 8 hours, created the data for the content. We pretty much started with nothing, no data to start with, and the data just built up over the time. And what we realized is that we were building the model in real time. And time is one of the most critical things in terms of news, time sensitivity. So this model was evolving over time. And that's the experiment that would become SciO2. If you haven't noticed up in the corner, SciO2 is there. SciO2 is the product that we call our natural language processing pipeline. Silicon dioxide is quartz, just for a quick connection. Silicon, key element in everything that goes from glass to microchips, so we consider silicon to be that core of global business. And then oxygen is the journalistic voice that Quartz breathes into global business news cycle. So within that context, entities, which we've heard a lot about, are key linguistic anchors that help define the context and are defined by the context. And so we wanted to create, as we go from this first experiment, we wanted to build out a stronger infrastructure that was really going to help, one, be time aware and be able to be the most informative about the content that we cover and produce throughout. So entities were the key in that. We took the standard entities that we come with spaCy, and then we added upon those, including one for technology, nature, process, media. There are a few others, but this construct one is one that we have created to represent an in-between stage. Because what we found is that language as an evolution changes. And so something that today was just a noun can become a construct and then later on become an org. And so you want to be able to map those changes throughout time as well. We started out, this is not big data, so it's not going to seem impressive for everybody, but we started out with 70,000 articles, which was 1.4 million blocks of text. And we turned that into 85,000 labeled sentences with the entities that were the most representative of us for our base model, and trained a model based off of that in spaCy. And from that, we were able to then do analysis on all of our content. So if you look here, machines with brains is one of our obsessions. These are the entities that sort of represented within machines with brains. Over here, you can see that we're talking about Tesla, and we can see how that Tesla sentences are being analyzed. We utilized the Harvard Inquirer set to build into the spaCy pipeline some more classifications. So that's how we're getting our active and passive voices and then over and understatements, which is ties right back to what that style guide was, so that we know how these things are fitting within our style. And below here, you can sort of see even the training sentences that were being utilized to go there. So the spaCy model really made rich analysis for any given text easy to do on the fly. But when you're talking about a corpus, where we have a corpus, we need to be able to not just have that analysis when we need it, or we need to be able to not just be able to analyze that, we kind of just want that analysis. And so storing the analysis of the large corpus became a vital resource for us. And that's where we introduced the language graph. So here's a language graph. If you look here, we've got Germany in the center. This is just a small snapshot to be readable, but Germany here is in the center as an entity. It's connected to all these various tokens, which are titles of different articles. And if you look very specifically, you can see here it's connected to Tesla, and we have all of the dependency mapping for each of the tokens within there are mapped in this graph. So the language graph is also a mutable map of the language model. So we take the whole corpus, do the spaCy analysis for the whole corpus, and it becomes this huge graph of all the language relationships. Now, any new content that's analyzed is then pushed also to the language graph. So if our journalists are working on an article, they publish that article, the first thing that happens is that article gets analyzed and then added to the language graph. And then changes from within that graph can be incorporated into the next iteration of the model. So again, I said time sensitivity is one of the most important things. The language graph itself becomes a representative both of the time that it exists, but also its changes over time, so that you can take any snapshot and sort of see that. And then when it's time to train a new model, you can then say, let's go to the language graph and pull out the content that we need that's going to be able to train that model. A big example would be 3G and 4G weren't things that people were actually talking about a lot, but when 5G came onto the market, it was like, oh, we're talking about 5G, and 5G became a thing. So we start seeing in the language graph, 5G is a thing. We need to make sure that we're being able to train a model with 5G included into that. And then the language graph becomes a primary resource for extracting new training data. So all of that information is there. Anytime that we want to pull out a model, we can say, let's go, or we want to build a model, we say we need this data set. Let's pull out the information that's most relevant for that data set, and then create the data set for it and train a new model based off of it. Again, snapshots of time can be extracted from the language graph so that you can say, give me everything in 2018 and get a whole bunch of data from there. Give me what happened on this day. We'll be able to roll back a model and say, let's do the model for this day and what happened on this day to analyze the content on this day. And so in that way, context can be derived by looking at the relationships also within the language graph. So we can start seeing, again, that 5G example, what are the words that are surrounding 5G? So here, if we look, this is Elon. Oh, you can't really see this. Oh, that's unfortunate. I promise there's a graph there. And it's a graph that represents Elon Musk's appearances over the course of our corpus. And right around there, there's a big spike, which is a funny joke because that's when he was smoking weed. And this is Jeff Bezos, which again, you can't see, was sort of low. And then there's a spike a little bit over here, which is around the time he released that very buff-looking photo. And all of a sudden, he becomes a personality that people are talking about more. And then Mark Zuckerberg, same thing. You get over around here, and there's a huge spike, and we can all imagine what that's about. But if you want to zoom in, this is Mark Zuckerberg in the center, and then we can see from the language graph all of the things that are surrounding Mark Zuckerberg at a specific time, so that we know Facebook, security, chief power CEO, those are the top things that are sort of associated with that, and that starts giving you context for what's happening at that specific time for that person. So SiO2, silicon dioxide, is a living natural language pipeline of network algorithms trained on the corpus of Quartz to understand the linguistic patterns of global business news. That's a mouthful. I want to stress living, which is the time sensitiveness. And the network algorithms is that there's never going to be that one algorithm. There's never going to be that GA. You're going to be stitching together things that sort of make it speak to the use case that you're doing. So we have a lot of different use cases that we have. SiO2 is the backbone, and then we have a whole bunch of other things that sort of connect to it to be able to do those. The pipelines. We have our Quartz corpus, which has training sentences that we put into spaCy to do our initial model. Then we have new content, which goes through spaCy and is added to the language graph. Then we have the language graph from which we can pull out training data and start doing statistical models and classifiers based off of, or the language graph can pull out training sentences that we then use to retrain a new spaCy model. Any unseen content passed through spaCy for pre-processing and then can be run through our classifiers and statistical models, all based off of that spaCy model that we're, again, reiterating on multiple times. Some small examples, so we're working in terms of maybe having an editor that's doing the analysis on the fly so that users can be able to actually know whether or not they've gone too far passive or too far active. Similarly, actually, I'll just point out here, this was during a talk that I was doing on bias, which is something that if anybody is interested in talking to me about bias, I'd love to talk about bias because it's one of those things that explainability and bias, it's not going to go away, people, so let's make sure we're talking through it. And then this was utilizing for the SciO2 to analyze tweets during, I think this was World Economic Forum Davos, being able to analyze what the conversation was like and then analyzing it against the context of the content we were producing. Over here, another quick tool is we get tons of white papers. Our journalists can then just throw the white paper to Slack, and then it breaks out a whole analysis of it based off of the pipelines that we have. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk to you about. Thank you again for the time. Thanks to Matt and Inez for putting this together. It's been an amazing, I'm inspired. Hopefully everybody's got a little inspiration from me, and I'd love to talk to you all later.